Well, hello everyone out there in Videoland, and I'd like to thank everyone who's responsible for this video. It's my very first video, so please be understanding. It's a brand new experience for me, and I hope this time together helps us to better understand each other and better to understand the world that we're living in from the past to the present with a different perspective. As you know, perspectives today are very, very narrow. So I'd love to be able to give you an alternate point of view for you to consider. And that's what I'm asking you to do. I'm not asking you to necessarily believe everything that I say, even though it's backed by fact. But I always say, consider. And by considering, you open up your possibilities for a greater or better understanding on any given subject.
So, how are you doing tonight?
Well, I'm doing wonderfully. I've been looking for this moment for quite a long time, and I'm very thankful that you're allowing me this opportunity to share with the public.
And I'm glad to have you, and I'm really grateful to learn even more beyond what you've taught me already. You've taught me so many things, and it's really exciting for me. I I know we're going to travel back in time a little
Yes.
bit and hear some of your story. We're also going to talk further about your experiences living in Cuba. After all, that is where you're from originally, and we're also going to learn about some of the dangers that are present today. Some of the warning signs, you might say,
Hmm.
that you've seen in our country. And so, your name is Ernesto Gonzalez. You are a Cuban immigrant, a Cuban historian in your own right, a teacher, and a speaker. And the broad topic here is to cover how to survive in a totalitarian communist regime, the history of Cuban communism, the American dream, and how to guard American freedom in the face of the new democratic socialist menace in 21st century America. So, would you tell us all about your life right now and follow that up with your story?
Well, I was an only child of Ernesto and Emma Gonzalez, and I was born during the previous administration under Fulgencio Batista, as he was called, the former dictator of Cuba, who abdicated on December 31st, 1958. So I was roughly about 2.5 years old when he came into power. That means Fidel. And I began to notice from a very early age that we were entering a different time period. My earliest levels of education about what was coming I received from my father, who gave me some very stern warnings as to how things were about to change. And then the rest I learned on my own. It seems to be a common theme in my life. I,
Mm-hmm.
I have that ability to learn and learn from, in my case, from a very early age. Probably not the kind of experience that many people have, but I do have a solid foundation as to how it began, how it affected my life, and how it actually affected my family and my other members of the family as well.
And so, when did you when did you come to the United States?
Well, if I may give an introduction as to how we got here, we would we were due to leave shortly after September 17th, 1962. I still have the passports, which you have seen,
Mm-hmm.
and they're all stamped with that particular date on it. However, we were not aware that things were going to change very quickly. It was just my parents and myself. And as you probably know from history, in October of 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis came into being, which in effect canceled all our visas and placed us in a position of not knowing when and if we were going to be able to leave. As a result, the visas were canceled, and we had to wait an additional 6 years and able to leave under the Cuban Adjustment Act passed by Lyndon Johnson in November of 1966. We were then placed on a waiting list, and the conditions for leaving were the following. You were allowed to leave if you had a sponsor in the United States. And the reason for that is so we wouldn't become a burden to the welfare system of the United States, which was reasonable. As a result, my mother had a sister who had arrived in the United States back in 1948 with her family, had become a citizen in 1952, and she was more than willing to sponsor us to come into this country, as well as other members of the family who unfortunately did not take the opportunity as much as they should have. But my mother was always at the vanguard of the family, and she said, definitely, I do not want my son to live in what's coming. Therefore, we most graciously accept your offer, and we became those who would be allowed freedom. And we were actually given a number. Our number was 103,912 on the list, but we never knew when exactly that number was going to come because there was no real warning. It was, it's time for you to go. Get ready. And between 1966 and 68, certain events took place that had a great level of influence upon my life and on my parents' life. My father was fired from his job in 1966 because of his failure to, or his unwillingness to become a member of the Cuban Communist Party. And that gave the government an excuse to fire him from his job. And he was placed on public works, which is incredibly brutal work. Working on the streets, 100-degree plus weather, dew points in the 70s, with no modern machinery, just pick and shovel and opening up streets and doing that sort of work. And I do remember when he did have his previous job, I used to go with him in the evenings. It was cleaning this wonderful building that had once been called Amber Motors, which was part of the Chevrolet dealership in the 1950s. And they had a wonderful library, and I used to love to go through the books, and that was one of my early experiences with learning, just picking up books and just learning about things, reading political books at the age of 10. But I had already had earlier experiences that clarified more or less where this was going. Mm-hmm. And this story goes back to, my earliest memories go back to 1961, when the Bay of Pigs incident was a total fiasco. It turned out to be a total fiasco because informants here in the United States and also members of the press mm-hmm. and other entities pretty much gave away the plan, which was deeply flawed in its very nature, but nevertheless it should have never been revealed. And if anybody knows anything about the Bay of Pigs incident, there were a series of 1,400 expatriates who were training in Guatemala under the guise of patriots and liberators with the aid of the CIA, and they were going to train to land in the mountains of the Bay of Pigs. Not the mountains of the Bay of Pigs, but they were going to land on the beaches of the Bay of Pigs, and they were to hold territory for a period of about 48 hours. In 48 hours, this has all been revealed on declassified documents, it's not just my opinion, that the United States would, if the soldiers or the expatriates were not to establish a beachhead within 48 hours, that the full might of the American military was supposed to come in and, so to speak, save the day. However, President Kennedy had very different ideas. He had already opposed the plan inherited by the Eisenhower administration, which was deeply flawed. It was very, very, very poorly organized, and Castro had already knowledge of the landing site and of the plans, and we can blame that to the New York Times for publishing the whereabouts of the training camps in Guatemala. And basically, Johnson said, well, what good is it to have a covert operation if Fidel Castro can read it on the cover of the New York Times? But nevertheless, he went through with it because he was still young, inexperienced, and he trusted the wisdom of the previous administration. And eventually it did fail because of lack of proper organization, preparation, and the lack of intervention when the time was needed. Basically, the people were marooned on the beaches of the Bay of Pigs, and ultimately Castro captured 800 out of the 1,400. The rest, no one knows what happened to them. And eventually they were to be, in a very humiliating defeat for the United States, to be traded for medical supplies, food, and other basic needs, in also agricultural machinery, in the terms of an agreement totaling $68 million, which, when you do the mathematics of what $68 million was worth in 1962, because they spent nearly a year in prison, and basically he was bribed. Kennedy was bribed by Castro, and Castro graciously took the offer in exchange for the 800 prisoners who landed in Cuba previously, along with 1,400. Now they had been released and landed in Miami, Florida. President Kennedy gave a rousing speech about a free Cuba and giving them folded Cuban flags, but it was totally disengaged from reality. There was a lot of bitterness from the expatriates who had spent nearly a year in Cuban prisons, and Cuban prisons are extremely harsh. If you know anything about the Soviet system of incarceration, you know that it was definitely not something that was pleasant. And a bitterness grew within Unit 2508, which was the number of the 2509 was the name of the brigade, Brigade 2509. And this brigade was to become a symbol of a failed attempt to liberate Cuba, and it also a failure by the Kennedy administration to change plans, not go through the second strike, which took out, the first strike took his Air Force out, a good portion of it. The second strike would have destroyed the Air Forces of Fidel Castro completely, but they didn't. They had a chance to regroup, and Fidel ordered there would be no intervention. There would be no U.S. involvement. And that sounds familiar to what has been happening over the years and what is even happening now. That changed our history forever. And I knew this as early as April and May of 1961. Keep in mind that I was not even yet 5 years old, but I do have an incredibly strong memory of those years. You know, I remember seeing Castro parading, much like the Romans used to do, parade their prisoners through the island, and people would spit at them, people would curse at them, people would call them traitors. It was a very humiliating experience. I found out later about the true cost of their return to the United States, but there used to be a common joke in Cuba that said, well, the prisoners are being exchanged for baby food. This is a very, very, very difficult time. And we knew that that was a crossroads, as I like to call it, in Cuban history.
And I'd imagine these and other things are extremely hard to forget.
Oh, yes.
They leave an imprint in the mind, and especially that of, let's say, a 5-year-old. And so you finally left in 1968.
Yes, to be exact, on July 5th, 1968, we left. We had received a notice from the government that we were finally going to allow to immigrate in
Mhm.
April of 1968, and we had to make provisions for that. And one of the provisions that you had to make was to forsake all your belongings except just the clothes on your back and a small amount of change in terms of clothing and so on. We had to turn over our appliances, including the television set, the refrigerator, our furniture, because in his view we were traitors to the fatherland, and therefore it was deserving for those who would come after us to get those things which we gave up, but we had actually no choice. And I remember being there when an inventory was given of all the things that we had. There was a military woman who came in and wrote out everything that we had and made sure that everything was documented. And then after that, a seal was placed. We were basically thrown out of our apartment, and a seal was placed right at the edge of the door when the door opened. So if that seal would break, we were warned it would be grounds for keeping us because it could be sabotage.
And now I also recall at one point you mentioning that there were certain things that even you personally were deprived of.
Yes, for one thing, we were not even allowed to take our family photos with us. And something that was still quite important to a 12-year-old, which was my orange teddy bear, which was very dear to me, and I had to leave that behind too. So I left just with a blue and white shirt. I can still see myself wearing it. A whole 75 pounds at 12 years old. And my parents just a certain amount of things they were able to carry, personal belongings mostly.
How were both of your parents behaving at this moment while they were going through observing the inventory taking process and you not being able to leave with your teddy bear and things of that sort? How did especially your father, how did he react to all of this?
Well, my father was the kind of person who was not extremely expressive in the way he conducted himself. He was the sort of person that more or less either reacted in somewhat of a violent way, I mean verbally, or he just became somewhat disengaged. My mother was really the real leader of the family, and my father was working the day of the inventory, and he was willing to do whatever was necessary for us to leave. So that's why he knew that if he signed the document making him a member of the Communist Party, basically that was his death sentence, so to speak, because he could not leave. So he was willing to sacrifice that for us, and we were very grateful for it. Shortly after our announcement was given that we were about to leave, my father was sent to a concentration camp for 45 days. He was fairly fortunate because other people spent more time than that. And he told me quite clearly how horrendous the conditions were. If you can imagine in 100-degree weather cutting sugarcane the way slaves did in the 18th century, with sleeping in hammocks, with scorpions running up and down your body, and guards pointing rifles at you at the slightest moment, because of course if a prisoner was shot, it wouldn't be a problem because it would always be an issue of, well, my trigger slipped, it was an accident, he was trying to escape, so therefore everyone was under an extreme level of heightened tendency to be very, very careful about what they did. But he was allowed to leave after 45 days, and then we were rejoined as a family, and we lived for 3 months, so April, May, June, July of 1968, basically the end of June, at my aunt's house, my uncle's house.
And your mother, was she required to engage in any forced labor? or was she just simply able to mind you and?
In those days, still a lot of the traditional values, and if you know anything about Spanish culture, were very family oriented. And
Oh, yes.
even in those days, Castro did not yet have full control over family obligations and customs and so on. Yes, indoctrination was a major implementation of the system, and I do recall, as I have shared with you before, and I was in preschool, and I remember receiving a visit from a uniformed guard who was a member of the secret police, which was the G2, as they were called, and we were expressly told, I'll never forget it, that it was our patriotic duty to report anyone, including our very own parents, if we ever heard them say, or we heard any family member or a friend or anyone who dared to speak ill of the revolution. And that really finally opened up my eyes again. I was just barely almost 61, so I was about 5.5 years old. And I knew that that was going to be a model, and it was tested, because indoctrination was already in progress, as it is in many of our schools today. They start with the young. And fortunately, thank to God, I give God all the credit in the world for making me what I call indoctrination proof, and I get to know the right from wrong from that very early age.
And taking that image that conjures up the 20 plus years prior, with the two regimes that came out of the third decade of the 20th century, the similar behaviors and tactics used by both the Nazis and by the Stalinists, and absolutely terrifying.
Well, it is in particular because the main enemy of the party of communism and socialism is the family unit. The family unit must be destroyed, because once it's destroyed, the system expropriates you, and now you are a property. In essence, in communism and socialism, you are owned by the state. So whatever your thoughts are, it doesn't matter. You must follow the order as given, and there's no deviation in any kind of critical thinking or critical answer to a given policy or attitude or a law was not allowed at all. And I was able to get away with some of my rebellion towards the system because I was young, but many people were not as fortunate. Many people spent many years in prison because of a simple disagreement. And in Cuba, this is important to point out, and is very reminiscent of what is happening in this country, an allegation equals truth. And I think most of you would understand what I mean by that. Let's say I would tell my moderator that he's guilty of a crime, and I would report him to the local authorities. The local authorities did not have to have any proof. In this country, we still have what's left of due process. There's no such thing as due process. If I say this person here and there or their family have been running an anti-government activity, that's all they needed, and they could easily be arrested. Usually the man was taken, and in those days they still respected the women. And no one really knew. No one was allowed to go to the trials, even though there were mock trials, there weren't real trials. It's what I called being guilty before being declared guilty. So it was a trap.
And of course, in this model, you are guilty until proven innocent.
Exactly, which is a complete opposite.
Yeah. Which kind of leads me to my next question is, as someone who, so in 1968 immigrated to the United States, you had the opportunity to learn of and participate in the American way of life. You learned English through immersion, total immersion, taking your courses, aside from simply trying to learn the content, math, English, social studies, sitting and trying to absorb that. You read the classics of English literature. You started eventually and provided for a family, began a successful career eventually as a teacher more than 25 years ago. And I can go on. What is your favorite part of the American dream?
Well, my favorite part of the American dream is the fact that individualism is at the very core of the American dream, which is something which is completely unacceptable. You must be part of the collective. And for those of you who are not familiar with the term, means that everyone has to think equally. And if you study socialistic or communistic systems, there is no room for the individual. There's only room for the faithful member who will, without question, follow orders. And if I may go back briefly, one of the other, it wasn't a real obstacle, but what is an obligation, which is also part of the earlier model of immigration, and especially in Hispanic families, and it's even somewhat relevant to today, is that the child became the parent's parent. I became their translator. I became their advocate. I was the one who they relied upon for everything. That's a lot of pressure to put on a 12 or 13-year-old when you're busy, as I say, growing up, and then you have to deal with all these things. I had already gone through several years of harassment, because harassment is part of the system. When they know you're leaving, they'll make your life as miserable as possible. They call you a traitor. We used to have a beautiful name added to us called worms. We were called worms, or gusanos in Spanish. So with all these things coming into America, and then so I arrived in July. By the fall of 1968, I was already in school, but I had been kept back. So I had the extra disadvantage, if you will, of studying in the 5th grade at the age of 12, which is rather old to be in the 5th grade. But I had to learn everything, and we were given about 3 months of cursory English, and then we were just thrown into the classroom, and occasionally they'd take us out and just gave us a bit of a lesson. But I think one of the turning points for me was when I read my first book in English, and I still remember it. It was in 1969, at the age of 13, called Our Town by Thornton Wilder, which has become a favorite book of mine, and which I've taught on my own for my first 7 years of teaching, which I taught American literature. And it was a tremendous milestone for me to be able to read an entire book.
I would say, yeah.
In a foreign language and understand it.
Yeah. And of course, at the time, there was no ESL.
Oh, no. We didn't have such luxuries. You learned on your own, and you were expected to learn on your own.
Correct.
And not to mention what was going on here, because there was an unusual dynamic taking place. The children who had left previously, when we were supposed to leave in 1862 and earlier, did not have a knowledge of what it was like to live in Cuba. And they looked down upon us because a lot of them came from upper and middle class. So they looked upon us as the working class, because we were just a working class family. My father was a cobbler, shoe cobbler. My mother was just a homemaker, or as they used to call her, housewife. And there was no real expectation for me to learn. My father's vision of success was to work in a factory for 40 years and get a pension and be part of a union. That was his dream for me. This is what you're going to do. This is all you're good for. Because my father was not a very encouraging individual. But I always felt that there was something more that I could do, something more that I could offer. And I fell in love with learning. And the more I learned, it was an insatiable desire that kept being fed. And of course, with everything available to me, this is long before computers. I spent time in the library, spent time borrowing books. And as you said, eventually at one time I would finally get the opportunity to go to college. But my journey to college is a rather peculiar one because I was not, and I will plainly admit to it, I was not a very good student in middle school and in high school. I was more or less cruising along, hoping to get out of high school. And I wound up graduating. I started high school at 17 and a half, and I remember my guidance counselor coming to me and saying, "What are you doing here? You're 17 and a half. You could be on your own. You don't have to be here." And I remember telling him, his name was Mr. Jackson, and I said, "Mr. Jackson, I really believe this is my obligation to finish my studies." And I remember him saying, "No, I applaud your efforts. I think this is commendable that you're doing this." So I wound up graduating at 20 and a half in 1977. And then I would enter the work world still with that mentality that I was meant for the workforce, and blue-collar work was nothing dishonorable. That's what was expected of me, so I did it. So between 1977 and 1981, now you can add up the years, how many years that was. You know how many people take a year off from high school in order to go to college? Well, mine turned into 13, and not even thinking of going to college because I was not supposed to go. The cost, number one, and number two, I was told that I was not capable of learning higher education, anything in higher education. And then I was finally challenged in 1990. Well, in 1985, I wound up starting to gather information on my own. I spent hours in the library gathering books, as of course long before computers became available, copying materials on microfiche and microfilm, and just gathering information between 1985 and 90. I didn't realize I was preparing myself for college. And a crossroad moment, as I like to call them, took place shortly in early 1990 when I was dating a girl from East Boston, and her sister was already going to UMass Boston. And I shared with my host here my rather awkward introduction to her boyfriend as we first met, and he says, "I am so and so," and I said, "Well, what's your name?" And he says, "Well, I am a living anachronism." And he thought, that is a peculiar way of introducing yourself. I think we need to talk. And then one day she just finally took me aside because I had started driving a school bus back on March 24th, 1981, driving a van for $4.50 an hour. My father had come to the United States working $1.50 an hour, working in a hotel in the evening shift. Then imagine washing cars in Miami heat by hand and just cleaning that hot metal. My father was a great example. He was a tremendous worker. He was not the kind of person who would be personally engaged in your inner life and in your interests and your goals or plans or ideas. It was, this is the way things are, which is very common to people of the Great Depression. Therefore you must obey or else. So I did. I was very faithful to my parents. I felt I owed them that. And in 1981, if you recall, well, of course you don't recall, you wouldn't, you might have studied it from history, but we had just gotten out of the Jimmy Carter recession and depression era, and jobs were scarce. So I had to, I found out there was a child on the way because I got married on May 3rd, 1980, yes, March 3rd, 1980, and I had a child on its way. So I took whatever I could get. I was just doing little odd jobs here and there, and then finally somebody told me, "Hey, the city of Boston is hiring school bus drivers, and you'll just start off in a van at $4.50 an hour, but it's at least something." Mm-hmm. So I took it. Eventually, I got my license and my school bus driver's license because in Massachusetts, this is where we went after we left Miami in 1970. and I wound up spending 32 and a half years over there.
So you were in Miami. Let me pause for one moment. So you were in Miami for how much time exactly?
From July 1968 to August of 1970. And if you like, I can share some of the experiences of our living conditions during that time period as well.
Yes. And just it would be interesting to hear what was it like. And there are so many stories of immigrants coming to the United States, and we can go back to the earliest waves in the postbellum period, particularly those arriving in New York City at Ellis Island, and the a lot of the Catholic and Eastern Orthodox and people from Central and Eastern Europe, and Jewish people coming and living in the tenement housing.
Yes.
under those conditions, and I think you had something a little similar to that, right? In Miami.
Well, first of all, the communists destroyed our family, split them along political lines.
Mm-hmm.
So there were, as it has been in recent years, this division that has existed between friends, between family members, is one of the things that they very much encourage, because they always thrive on division. If there's a united front, there's resistance. If there's division, there's a greater chance of indoctrinating you into their way of thinking, because the goal is to isolate you, and they did that very well. But my aunt and uncle had been here, as I mentioned, since 1948 here in the States, and they lived in what I would call middle class, somewhat of a middle class family lifestyle in Miami, when Miami was a wonderful place to live in back in the late 1960s. They had things that I could only dream about. I can remember watching my first color TV set, and I was completely amazed, as if I was entering a world of fantasy. And my father, and my uncle, using his remote control, which was, I didn't know at the time, was guided by radio waves, and actually I could see the knob moving through the channels just by pressing a remote. I had never seen anything like that. It was wonderful. Color TV was just like a wonderful experience for me. I know it sounds strange in today's world, but at that time, my father could not have afforded, obviously, $600 in 1966 when he bought it was a lot of money in 1966 dollars. So they lived a very, very affluent lifestyle, and we stayed with them for 3 months, the first 3 months of arriving here in the United States. But after that, they told us, well, it's time for you to leave. And they just threw us into a housing development, and we were living in probably the worst of all. It was the worst of all the apartments. It was basically a shack that would have been condemned by the Department of Health. But the slumlord was such an influential person that he used to pay off the inspectors. It was basically a shack with a roof partially caving in, 3 people living in one room with one little kitchen and one little bathroom that had just about everything that crawls under as Florida. And the place was had mold, and sometimes you take a shower and the maggots fall on you. It was a very, very difficult experience, and we survived for 2 years, almost 2.5 years of this, at a whole $70 a month that my father used to pay. And when you think of him making $101.50 an hour, he stretched it. But my father's view at the time, which was very common, was that he told my mother, well, you take care of the child, I am going to go out and I'm going to support the family. And I'm very grateful for that I had both of them, and that I did have my mother beside me. And my mother was a tremendously influential person in my life, not only in her ability to leave the country, but also as a model of of consistency and love and attention and what you would expect out of a family. And those were the very, very early years. By the time we got to leave in 1970, we were given an option whether we wanted to go to Indianapolis, Indiana, or to go to Boston, Massachusetts. Well, my mother once again had a sister who had moved to Boston, Massachusetts, and we decided. My mother said, "Well, I have a sister over there. Why not go over there?" Of course, I'm 14 years old at the time. I wasn't about to have any real opinion on the matter, but as you can imagine, life was extremely difficult. I lived unused. I don't mind saying this. I lived in used underwear that was donated by the local church, used clothing. My bicycles in the early days were made up of bicycles I used to find in the trash and put them together, and I felt I was on top of the world. Going fishing, watching a lot of television was also very instrumental in helping my auditory skills to learn the language. Listening to radio music was very important to me in those days as well.
One question I have is you may have had this question before, but possibly by some students of yours when you've taught Spanish. When was there do you remember a precise moment where you stopped speaking with an accent and began adopting another, let's say, perhaps the bit more of today, you have a bit more of the Bostonian character into your accent, but
well, I lived in a place called Jamaica Plain, which is part of Boston, but is somewhat of a suburb of Boston. In those days, it was mostly an Irish Catholic Italian neighborhood, and I went to the local Catholic school, went to Catholic church, and I used to call myself Catholic by trade because I didn't really know anything about Christianity or anything really beyond what I was being taught. But I remember in 1971, at the age of 15, I was going to really try to perfect this as much as possible, to perfect this new language in a new land, in a new environment, and to fully immerse myself in the entire culture. And for a number of years, I yearned to be part of the whole, what we used to call the Great American Melting Pot, which has now gone under a lot of different types of attack. And one of my goals was, if I am going to be in a foreign country, which was now my own, and I was very thankful to be here and to be allowed to come here, because my generation fought in Angola and in Ethiopia between 1975 and 1991. So within 3 years, I would have been inducted into the Cuban Army. So again, I felt there was divine intervention in there. And from then onward, I just strove to keep improving. And this went on through, as far as language-wise, through my... I have to admit, I was kept back in the 7th grade because my language skills were not adequate. And
right.
So that added another layer of age. So by the time I was in my second tour of duty, if you will, of the 7th grade, I was already about to turn 16, which is really pretty scary. At least I thought it was. But I got a chance to meet some people that I wouldn't have met. But that made me that more determined that this wasn't going to happen again, because one of the reasons I was given was because of my poor language skills. I was not going to make it. I failed English. I was not going to be allowed to go on to the 8th grade. So again, there's always been a goal to follow, but it's been between myself and God, because my parents, again, they were there. They were wonderful providers, which again is a typical feature of Depression-era parents, but again, not in the sense of getting to know who you are and what are your goals.
Of course.
But I was always by their side, and into my very 40s, I was still a faithful son to them, because I just felt, well, they took the time to take care of me, so now it's my turn to take care of them as they were growing older. And being an only child, there was nobody else. But yes, learning became a big part of my life, but I was not committed enough to be interested beyond high school. Just get out of high school, finish off, and go off into the workplace.
And thanks to that determination, you had the ability to help your parents and be their translator, help in various other ways. I'm sure if anyone needed medical attention, you could facilitate that, and then of course reaching the point in time where you could secure gainful employment. And we know that oftentimes learning English it's an essential to having anything greater as far as a career. To be a teacher, in most cases, you must be able to speak English. If you're going to work in public schools, for instance, as you have, so that's and of course, your would you say that knowing now what you said about your family that was here, and you've told me about your family who remained in Cuba.
Oh yes.
What became of them?
Well,
say who is left and what's happened.
Well, after once the revolution cemented itself after 1961, their battle lines, so to speak, were drawn, and there was those who were for the system and those who were against it. The more affluent members of the family decided to go with the Communist Party and to follow along their rules, because up until 1968 there were certain vestiges of private enterprise, much the way Stalin did after the death of Lenin, when he allowed a certain level of private enterprise up until 1939, in the beginning of World War II. Well, Castro did the same thing. Street vendors, private small business owners were allowed to work, and my aunt was a successful hairdresser. Mm-hmm. My uncle owned 2 businesses. He owned a lottery business, which was very big in Hispanic countries, mm-hmm. and also he used to own a record store. He used to always be dressed, in suit and tie. He was they were the aristocrats of the family, and they were offered also the opportunity to get out. But my sister and I had no sisters. My cousin Ileana was part of the education campaign, or the literacy campaign as they called it, between 1960 and 62, where a great movement was created among the young people to educate the illiteracy problem in Cuba, which was rather high outside of Havana. But the problem was that there wasn't a question of educating or teaching people how to read and write. It was a question of reading and writing what he called the re-education of the new man. When you start to hear that, and many of them said, we just want to learn how to read and write. We don't care about politics. We just want to be able to be literate. But of course, that's part of the campaign. It's always about indoctrination. It's always about gaining people to the fold. And in the early days of Castro, many people fell for it because they believed his lies, as he had been speaking them way back in 1955.
And we're going to touch on that certainly later on. And so, and I know also you've been back.
Yes.
You were back two times or 3 times?
I was back twice. I I had a chance to. I call it the salmon effect. As you know, the salmon always have to return to its
Right,
source.
right. That's a good analogy.
And as I get older, I began to have a yearning for what was left behind and who was left behind, because there were no real levels of communication. Telephone conversations were not even available. Most people didn't have telephone services. A letter used to take as long as it took in the 16th, 17th, and 18th century to go from the New World to Europe to 3 months. So a lot of things happened in 3 months. And
Certainly.
in scarcity, as it became more and more of a way of life, we just they didn't disappear, but they broke relations with us because they felt we were part of the problem. Because in Cuba, everything used to be blamed on the United States. The blockade that was instituted in 1960, which basically prohibited Castro from having commerce with the United States, but it didn't provide the same for other countries as well. So there was what I call an artificial poverty that it was instituted on the Cuban people. Between 1958 and 61, the majority of the upper classes and the middle classes were gone. Their businesses were expropriated, and American companies were expropriated from their own companies. Exxon, Mobil, major companies, Coca-Cola, the U.S. telephone company, the U.S. Nicaragua nickel plant was expropriated. And if you think again about numbers, the amount of losses that America took in early 1960s dollars exceeded over $2 billion. Now try to think about how much that is today. The United States has never been compensated for it.
Astronomical.
No individual was ever compensated. But the problem is the elite took the best for themselves and left the so-called crumbs for the rest of the people. Everything became rationed. And as we became more and more dependent on the Soviet Union, we started to adopt as a nation their system, which is a system of slavery.
I recall as an aside one conversation about this aid from the Soviet Union right about 1970, where the dependency where Cuba gained this dependency on the Soviet Union, and the number I recall was $1 million per day, correct, was being spent by the USSR on Cuba.
Yes, Cuba was a strategic gain for the Soviet Union. To have a communist nation only 90 miles away from the Florida Keys was a tremendous success, and a great deal of embarrassment, a level of embarrassment to the American system. And in 1961, after the failed Bay of Pigs, the Soviet Union began to try to fill the void that the Americans had left behind. And they would, of course, bring in Marxist-Leninism to its very, very basic levels. And one of the main problems that Cuba had was that it was a one-crop country. They were overly dependent on sugar all the way going back to the 17th century.
One of the biggest exporters.
The number one exporter of sugar in the world. Nickel, citrus fruits.
Mm-hmm.
But of course, none of these things became available to the public. As I went through the 1960s, less and less and less and less was available.
Mm-hmm.
As you know from studying Soviet republics and Soviet communism, the black market thrived, and people would give several months of their salary in order to just have basic necessities. Mm-hmm. It became an untenable way of life. Mm-hmm. And again, I feel very, very thankful that I was able to leave. And those very members who refused to leave wound up losing everything shortly after we left. their businesses were expropriated. And when I returned in 1997, the summer of 1997, I was appalled because they used to live in a close to a waterfront condo with marble floors, a beautiful place, and it seemed like something out of like a horror movie after a bombing. They look more like human zombies or apparitions than actual human beings. There's no medicine. I mean, people talk about socialism is going to give you free education. It's going to give you free medicine. It's going to health care. It's going to provide for you. Well, what good is a free education if you cannot choose what you're going to learn beyond the basics? Colleges was about whatever was necessary for the government was what you were supposed to learn. You were supposed to dedicate and bow down to the will of the government. Healthcare. What good is healthcare if there isn't enough medication? As I used to joke around with my students, just imagine yourself going to the doctor's office, getting an accurate description of what your ailments are, and then given a prescription and being told, well, good luck finding it. I mean, it was just an incredibly vicious cycle. And people began to become progressively more and more discontented, and then came what I would call the acting phase of the revolution, where people had to act in order to survive and say the right thing and clap at the right time, which you're familiar with. And you either adapted or you took a chance and you could wind up in prison for the rest of your life.
That's reminiscent, I'm sure, for many people, looking at some of the footage that's emerged, much of it smuggled, or at the very least what is allowed by the North Korean state to be released for public view. The parades of the military and the commemorations that are held, and the festivals, and even more solemn occasions, the death of Kim Jong-un's father, and the mourners that were present, who were required to mourn, to demonstrate mourning in various forms. If anyone were shown not to be mourning, that was definitely a risk to take.
Well, Castro was very careful not to inculcate what was known both in China and in the Soviet Union, which was the cult of the personality. And for those of you who are not familiar with the cult of the personality, is almost elevating a leader to the point of being a god who would somewhat magically would look upon your life, see you. It was a very, very eerie system. Castro was very careful not to create that, but he would rather bring other members who had fallen during the revolution as patriots, as heroes, as people to emulate. And again, it was constantly a system of eternal sacrifice. Nothing was ever good enough. And I think I mentioned to you the 1970 attempt to bring about 1 million tons of sugar. That's an incredible amount for a nation of about 8 million people. He basically emptied his businesses, or even government agencies. Everybody was supposed to go out there and cut sugarcane. And it's the only time, and this is all on video or film. And the one time when it failed, the sugar crop of 1970 was a failure. And it's the only time he ever admitted I can still almost paraphrase or even tell his exact words. I'm not going to beat around the bush. I'm going to tell you quite honestly, we did not meet our quota, which is of course a very humbling thing. But as with any communist leader, he turned the failure into a victory. He talked about the wonderful dedication of the Cuban people and the effort and the desire to create a better society with a greater sense of patriotism, and in the hour of failure, it is not real failure, but really a victory for the proletariat. I mean, these are just similar things. It was just, and of course, once you get to know, you realize that you have two choices. You either have to become part of the game, or expose it in some form or another. Again, I was shielded because of my age, but had I been a teenager or older, I probably would have been put in prison easily.
And I actually have here, this is something that you've shown me. This is your,
I wish our audience could see this.
these are your, and of course you could display them as well. I mean, these are some photos from which trip was it?
This was on my last trip.
2005?
2001.
2001.
I was there in 2001 and earlier in 2007.
Okay.
These were, if you're able to see it, these were beautiful Spanish architecture that had been left to ruins. Havana today is a ghost town. Cars are running just because the people are creative and they're able to make things run. But let me see if I can show you some of the other pictures here.
All stuck together.
Yes. This is, you see a horse and buggy here. This is 19th century living. Because you either have a choice. You either get gas or you starve. That's your choice. This here is a picture of a typical store in Cuba for regular people. Notice the tremendous abundance of these shelves. They're completely empty.
And those are medicine bottles. Well, is it a,
Yeah, some things were available, but again,
a small apothecary, pharmacy?
if you were to look at, as I've shared with my host here, what it used to look like, it's night and day. Here you see some more of the horse and buggies that people use for transportation. I actually traveled in one of them, and I was not really allowed to do it because I was a foreigner. See, over there I am a foreigner. I am no longer a Cuban, because once you leave, there's no such thing as dual citizenship. Once you leave, and you forsake everything. Look at these beautiful buildings that have been turned into just decaying structures of a long bygone past. Imagine if you didn't do any work to your property in 60 years, what it would look like. Because the communists don't believe in any kind of preservation. It's just, it doesn't matter. More of another horse and buggy here. And here's some more buildings. You could see they're in a dilapidated state. You can't buy cement. You can't buy paint. You can't buy even sanitary equipment of any kind. Some of the communist books were used for personal purposes, because such simple things as toiletries were not even available.
That brings to mind the as a homeowner, as homeowners, people have to think of code and any owner of a building, also a commercial building, has to consider the safety. And for instance, in one of these buildings, if you had a balcony that was deteriorating, how are you going to weld it back together so that somebody doesn't, you just can't.
You can buy solder. It is not uncommon for people to die from buildings crumbling upon their heads, because these buildings were built back in the teens and 20s, and some of them even earlier. And I saw whole sections of Havana and eastern Cuba just falling apart, whole sections that looked like as if you were walking through a war zone. Complete businesses, former businesses, and apartment complexes just completely destroyed. This is a photo of myself here visiting some of my older friends, if you're able to see it. There with a blue and white shirt in 1997. And look at the wall behind them, where all those years of not being able to clean or paint or do anything. These were beautiful places when I left them. And there are many such examples. And these things don't generally reach the American population. So they don't have any real idea of what it's like to live there. And I do want to address the so-called dreamers of socialism and communism